Welcome to our In Focus discussion tonight on inequality at the margins. Sometimes biases, racism, gender bias, sexism can be obvious, but more often than not, people of color struggle with biases that are subtle, like workplace issues and offhand comments and conversations. Tonight we want to talk about those instances of bias, bring awareness to them, define them, and hopefully provoke a little bit of change. We have a panel tonight of special guests. We start with Dr. Ann Villarreal, Vice President for Diversity, Inclusion, and Equity at the University of Utah, Shawn Newell, an Inclusion, Diversity, and Equity Consultant, and via Zoom, Neelam Chand, the owner of Shift SLC, an equity consulting firm. Thank you all for being here tonight. We will start our conversation with Ann. Ann, let's talk about some terminology. Could you define what a microaggression is, and could you give us an example of when you might have experienced one?
Oh, a microaggression simply is, or not simply, but is often between individuals. So that questions about or assumptions about where you might be are coded in, oh, you speak really good, you're English, you're really articulate, where did you learn English? The assumption that English would be a second language, or that your family is from elsewhere. I think there are a number of assumptions made by individuals in those conversations. So those are daily, how did you get this job? Oh, you must know somebody, that our qualifications aren't enough.
Neelam, same question to you. When do you remember experiencing microaggressions?
Yeah, the most common microaggression that I get is a simple question, where are you from? And I get it a lot here in Utah because there's just a lot of curiosity of where people are at and where they're from. But I get where are you from, and it's not the first time that they ask that same question in the same conversation. It's where are you from? And I say where I'm from. So I say usually Centerville, Utah, or I was born in California. And then they ask, no, where are you really from? And then I say, oh, well, I live in Mill Creek. No, where are you really from? And I know that they're trying to get out, what country did you come from? And it sounds, like I said, innocuous, but what it says, what it's implying is that you're not from here because you have brown skin or you don't look American. And I get that one a lot.
And Shawn, what about you? What microaggressions have you faced?
It's hard to choose from the many that I've faced in my lifetime. One of the ones that I get on a regular basis is, you must have come from a tough neighborhood, because I tell people I grew up in Southern California. Their assumption there is that, anybody who's, especially for African Americans, must have come from a tough place and didn't have the type of environment where it allowed us to be in the spaces we are in now. So that would probably be the one I get the most.
Yeah, and I've experienced microaggressions myself. The way I think of microaggressions is maybe a comment. It could be unintentional, but a comment that makes the recipient feel othered, like they're from a foreign place, or you have an expectation that they got to a certain place in life not because of their abilities, their skills, their talents, but because of some sort of advantage that they were given. So thank you so much for sharing your personal experiences with us. This next question is also something that I will direct to all of you. Ann, we'll start with you. I want to talk about implicit biases now. How are they different, and how have you experienced them?
The implicit bias is different in that it's a power play. One uses their power then to enact that microaggression, that assumption, that stereotype. Now they use it to make decisions, and that is unconscious often. I'm often mistaken at hotels for the server or the wait staff, and my dress, my skin is coded as a service worker. So those implicit biases are that I may not be a part of the conversation or why I'm there for a conference or a dinner, but rather I am there to serve others.
Wow. Neelam, what about you? What are your thoughts or experiences with implicit bias?
Yeah, so the way I think about bias is I think about the brain. It's sort of how your brain conceptualizes experiences that then inform your thoughts, that then inform the behavior or the decisions that you make. So for instance, when you meet someone, you quickly, within milliseconds, ask yourself, is this person like me or not like me? And if the person's not like you, so in the way they're dressed, in the way their skin color, in the way they talk, in their gender. If that person's not like you, all of a sudden your guards go up. And then you quickly decide whether or not you want to be empathetic with this person or you proceed with caution. And that's how bias is. It's really in your brain, it's the thought. And then when you think about bias and microaggressions, microaggressions is the action. It's how you then manifest some of your thoughts. And usually these biases are informed by your upbringing, society, social media, media in general, what people tell you, what another person that may not look or think like you should be, or they associate folks with stereotypes.
Shawn, let's hear from you. What are your thoughts and experiences when it comes to implicit bias?
I think one of the most important things that we need to understand is that we all have biases. And a lot of them are subconscious. We just don't know that we have them. And the realization that we have them sometimes have to come from a different source. In my case, I've been in the business world for quite a while, and I have called up to a place of business. I've sat in the waiting room, and I've had the individual that I have the appointment with come out, look around the room, and then walk back into their office and tell the person at the desk that they're waiting for an appointment, and here I am sitting right here. And they have to come back out again, and most times they do apologize, but they don't realize that that is based on their bias that they maintain and aren't really aware of.
Very interesting perspectives, and we're just touching the tip of the surface. Marianne, Shawn, and Neelam, hold that thought. We're going to take a quick commercial break, but when we return, we'll resume our In Focus discussion on inequality at the margins. Thanks for staying with us for our second In Focus discussion tonight on inequality at the margins. We pick up our conversation now with Dr. Ann Villarreal, Shawn Newell, and Neelam Chand. Marianne, we will start this conversation again with you. So we've gone through some examples on everyday bias. I'd like to talk about now how these biases can hurt individuals and communities. Can you talk to us about that?
Well, I think a most recent example of that is, as people where they joked about it. I mean, the microaggression around COVID-19 and the coronavirus is the quote Chinese virus. The harm, right, that is caused, when young children hear that, when they wonder if they're at fault, when the message is, you don't belong here. And that is, the microaggression in the everyday makes you wonder, do I belong here? What is my worth? What is my value? And always having to try harder to prove otherwise.
And Shawn, talk to us about the talk, which happens when African Americans first start how to drive and how it permeates the African American story.
The talk is very serious. What it is a discussion that parents have with young men, especially of color, and young women of color, about the way that they have to behave out in society once they leave their front door. These topics that they discuss include their engagement with law enforcement, their engagement with their educators that they're dealing with. And these engagements are designed, based on the parents' discussion, to help mitigate issues that may arise from simply the color of their skin. And this is a critical thing that impacts a lot of young people, sometimes not even realizing why they are receiving this conversation from their parents. And we got today where mothers are terrified to send out their young men of color just for them to go to work or to go to school because they don't know if they're going to return back home.
It's such a sad conversation that parents have to have with their children at such a young age, and sometimes I can only imagine that these children and these teens are struggling to understand, why do I have to do this simply because of the color of my skin or who I am? So Marianne, can you distinguish between these issues of everyday racism and the evolution of thought on public conversations that we're having now? Conversations like Confederate statues and the name change of Dixie State University.
Well, I'd say that there's actually very little distinction. The everyday racism that we experience, there's almost just very blatant discriminatory ideas. They're all rooted in this hierarchy, right? The value and worth of one human over another. And so when we talk about I'll say Confederate statues, for example, you know, we return we say as a nation we value these because we go back to this place where where we're believing that hierarchy matters, that one race is valued than another, and that's just the legacy of our country. And until we can name it, until we can sit and have you know, real conversations about the harm that supporting that how that happens, will continue to, you know, perpetuate harm on people of color across this country.
Yeah, in these conversations, there's minimalization of trauma and harm here, right? We didn't have the intention of harming, or it's about history or heritage, and it's like, it doesn't really matter what your intent is. The fact is there is harm being done here, and you can't try to minimize that with whether or not you had the intent to harm. So Neelam, can you talk a little bit about how you view the mascot issue that people of color have been talking about before they grew into public consciousness?
Yeah, so just like what we say matters, symbols also matter. And Black, Indigenous, people of color communities have long been impacted by slogans, logo, ads, monuments, in a negative way, because most of them are embedded in a very painful history of racism in America. And they perpetuate, like we had talked about earlier, these negative stereotypes and often inaccurate information that allows people who are not part of the marginalized community to exploit or to use as in a very disrespectful way. Activists have been fighting for name changes for over a decade, if not longer. So when you take sort of the Native inspired mascots, they're usually under the guise, you know, when you think about these organizations that are using these mascots, they're usually under the guise of honoring Indigenous people. But when asked, how is honoring Indigenous people, how are you doing that? What are the actions? What are the concrete actions that you're taking? That's a tougher question to ask. And typically these mascots are being portrayed as caricatures or putting Native Indigenous people in just in history and not thinking about sort of modern culture. So it's very, very, very harmful.
Right, and you know, like you said, we're hearing this argument about mascot tree is a tribute. Well, Native Americans didn't ask to have that as a tribute to them in that way. And we see a lot of other mascots who are animals, right, symbols, but it seems like that specific ethnic group is the only one who is, you know, turned into a caricature. And for them, at least for those that have spoken to us, they say it's very dehumanizing. Shawn, I'm going to give the last question in this discussion to you. So another topic that has come up recently is flags in schools. Some school districts consider pride flags or Black Lives Matter flags political, and they want to ban them. Others welcome them. So where does this issue fit into our conversation tonight?
I believe there's a misunderstanding there. These flags represent the students themselves, and they have to be allowed to bring their full selves to their institutions so that they are ready to learn and ready to engage people. When we look at the flags in our communities, these represent safe places for people to be able to live and exist, especially for young people walking to and from school. You know, this is one of those things that people tend to drive their stake into the ground about because they don't understand that full understanding of what it is to bring your full self, because they've been able to do that throughout their lives. A lot of these students that are facing issues that are different from those that are considered the norm don't have that comfort level to be able to engage in a way that they can be who they truly are. And it's important that that happens, because if you cannot be your full self, be it in school, be it in work, or be it in your community, you cannot grow, develop, and have your best life possible.
Right, being LGBTQ+, or being a person of color is not a left or right issue. It's not a Republican or a Democratic issue. It's literally a human rights issue. And so I love that we're having this conversation, but stay with us. We have to take another quick commercial break, but when we return, we'll pick up our conversation on inequality at the margins. Welcome to our third and final In Focus discussion tonight on inequality at the margins. We return now with Dr. Ann Villarreal, Shawn Newell, and Neelam Chand. Shawn, this time we will start with you in this conversation. A recent Wallet Hub study says that Utah is at the bottom in terms of diversity. So what does this say about the work that we still need to do?
It says that there's a lot of work to be done. And there's a lot of misnomers out there about diversity. When we say diversity, we have to understand that each and every one of us has some semblance of diversity within us. And when we talk about this topic, we have to add other things to it, including equity. We have to add inclusion. We have to add belonging. We have to add access. So there's a lot to unpack when we talk about diversity. But, you know, for the state of Utah, there's a lot of efforts going on right now in business and education to try to mitigate the misunderstandings that exist out there in our communities. But what we have to do is do this as a collective. We can't just have small numbers of people pushing to gain greater understanding. It's going to take all of us to get this and accomplish this, and we have to be able to do the work together.
And on that note, Marianne, you've instituted a lot at the University of Utah. Can you talk about the Reframing the Conversation panel series?
Yeah, the Reframing the Conversation series began right before we all moved to remote work, but it was really our opportunity to bring together members across campus and the community to really start to identify the different. There are various perceptions. There are a number of ways of talking about a particular topic. And we wanted to hear from everyone, and we wanted it to be an opportunity for our students to ask questions across the board. And I'd say that beyond the Reframing the Conversation, real quick, that one of the things we're launching now is Intersect 12, that it is, you don't just walk in, I don't walk into a space just as, you know, Latinx. You know, I walk into a space that is around queer identity, that is around parent, that is around, you know, certainly being Latinx, you know, gender fluid. I mean, so there's not one way of talking about a person, and I think that's the piece that we're really wanting for our community to really explore over this next year.
I agree, and I think you said it well, is that even all of us who may fall under one ethnic group, we have so many different intersectionalities, and all of our individual experiences are so different. Like, my experience as an Asian American is different from someone who is Asian, right? Or someone who may be, you know, Afro-Asian, or someone who may be like a Latina Asian. And so you bring up a great point. Neelam, your company consults on diversity in the workplace. Can you tell us about what you generally recommend to businesses who want to address these issues?
Yeah, so the first thing that I advise organizations to do is assess where they are in their diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging journey. This means understanding what are the sentiments around these issues. How do the leadership team feels about these issues? Is it a priority? How are employees experiencing their workplace in a day-to-day basis? Are there microaggressions? And are your practices informed by biased decisions? So how's the overall workplace culture? And do people feel like they can give feedback? I think these are really important questions to ask and assess before you even think about moving forward. And then once you've assessed, then you're able to really proactively think about strategies that address these individual challenges or barriers. And I think that this is really important to be proactive because we don't want to wait until another incident happens or there's a litigation or, you know, in the summer of 2020, after the murder of George Floyd, all these organizations decided to jump on issues of race. You want to be able to have those conversations, and you want that embedded into your business so that it doesn't feel like it's something that you're reacting to.
Well said. I love your recommendation of being proactive instead of reactive. Shawn, what do you recommend to individuals who feel like they are victims of implicit bias or microaggressions?
One of the most important things is that you report it. You need to let people know, especially the superiors or those that are leaders in your companies, that these incidents have happened. That way you can, have something to back up when you go to bat for yourself and try to make sure there's a correction. You can also do, one of the other simple things is have dialogue with the person that has committed a microaggression and have a conversation with them and explain to them what that was that upset you and how it impacted you. And do that in a way that is respectful, but also do it in a way so that that person understands that they cannot speak to you. Language is really important. And when we work in the workplace, we have to have an understanding and respect for each other that's conducive to us to be able to work together as team members. So make sure that you either speak up to your HR folks, to your superiors, but also have conversations with those around you.
Language is everything. I think that's a really great takeaway from this conversation. Marianne, we have to wrap, but real quick, can you tell us about your panel on Friday?
Yep. Friday Forum will be hosting Dr. Estella Ben-Simon from USC and Dr. Jelani Cobb, international conversation about what does it mean to lead with equity. And that's what we're doing this next year, and we hope to invite all of you and our partners here today to be both in conversation and in action with us.
You've been hearing from Dr. Ann Villarreal, Vice President for Diversity, Inclusion, and Equity at the U of U, Shawn Newell, Equity, Diversion, and Inclusion Consultant, and Neelam Chand, owner of Shift SLC. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight to talk about this important topic.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll be right back.